Good morning, everyone. We're going to start in a minute. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Middle East Strategy Forum 2021, organized by the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. My name is Bijan Ahmadi, and I'm the Executive Director of the IPD. We have an exciting day ahead of us, 4 panel discussions and our launching lecture with Dr. William Ruger. Those of you who have registered for the conference already receive all the information, the conference program, the links that you need to join via Zoom or YouTube Live in your email. You can also simply go to our website at peacediplomacy.org to find the conference program and the links that you need for watching the panels. I would like to once again acknowledge and thank the Hill Times, Al Monitor, and the American Conservative as media sponsors of MESF 2021, and the Quincy Institute and Toronto Finance International as supporting organizations for this conference. Our first panel for today is titled Future of Diplomacy and Engagement in the Middle East. For this panel, we have Elizabeth Hagedorn moderating the discussion. Elizabeth is a correspondent based in Washington for Al Monitor, where she covers Middle East policymaking and breaking news with a focus on diplomacy and the State Department. She previously reported on the region as a freelance journalist in Turkey and Iraq, covering conflict and migration. Elizabeth currently chairs the National Press Club's Association for International Correspondence. Thanks, Elizabeth, for being with us today. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Bijan, for that introduction. And thank you to all who are joining us. I am really thrilled to be here today for what I think is going to be a very timely discussion on how diplomacy can de-escalate tensions and reduce conflict in the Middle East. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our distinguished panel. First, we have with us Trita Parsi. He is the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft here in Washington. He is an expert on Iran-US relations, Iranian foreign policy, and geopolitics of the Middle East. Ebtisam El-Ketbi is the founder and president of Emirates Policy Center and is the first Arab woman to lead a think tank. She is a professor of political science at the United Arab Emirates University. Abdullah Babood is an Omani academic focusing on economic, social, and political development in GCC states and their foreign policy. He is the former director of Qatar University's Center for Gulf Studies and is currently a visiting professor at Waseda University in Tokyo. And finally, we have with us Ambassador John Allen. He served as Canada's ambassador to Israel from 2006 to 2010 and is currently a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. So thank you all so much for being here. We have a lot of ground to cover, but before we get started, I just wanted to remind our audience watching on Zoom that you can submit your questions for our speakers by using the Q&A feature, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can. So with that, Trita, I'll go to you first. You have argued that when it comes to its relationship with Iran, that the U.S. should think bigger beyond restoring the JCPOA. Are improved relations with Tehran key to the nuclear deal's long-term survival? And is that sort of change in the U.S.-Iran relationship even possible?
First of all, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the Institute for putting together this very timely discussion. And it's a great honor to be here with my co-panelists discussing these issues. Yes, I think the experience of the last couple of years show that the idea that the US-Iran relationship and that the JCPOA can survive in a context in which the US-Iran tensions continue as they have been in a very, very tense situation is quite unlikely. if we want to see the JCPOA actually be able to survive, it cannot survive in a strategic vacuum. There has to be some movement towards reducing the tensions between the United States and Iran and other regional players in tandem with it. Otherwise, it is unlikely, in my assessment, that the various tensions will not inflict so much damage on the JCPOA so it doesn't collapse. And at the same time, I think it is also essential for the region as a whole. Tensions between the United States and Iran has been a key element as to why there's been additional tensions in the region. In Iraq, for instance, Iraq has oftentimes ended up becoming an arena for competition between the United States and Iran. And it's not been the type of constructive economic competition that we're talking about. We're talking about a very negative, destabilizing, disruptive competition. And as a result, it would be a mistake, not just for the sake of the region, to stop at the JCPOA and not try to pursue diplomacy to be able to address these other issues. But it would also be a mistake from the standpoint that the JCPOA itself probably will not survive unless there at least is somewhat of a positive trajectory in the US-Iran relationship as a whole. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm not saying that it won't be tremendously tricky and it won't require a lot of political capital on both sides. But in the last 40 years, the only time the United States has managed to get a dramatic shift in Iran's national security policy has been through this very intense multilateral diplomacy that preceded the JCPOA. So if we want to see changes in other Iranian policies, whether it is missiles or other issues, the path that has been successful, the only path that has been successful, has been diplomacy.
Okay, thank you for that. There's a lot that we can get into later in the conversation. Ebtisam, this next question is for you. Qatar is calling on Iran and its Gulf neighbors to agree on a format for a region-wide dialogue. How much of an appetite is there among GCC states to work toward de-escalation with Tehran, and what will it take for them to come together for a comprehensive dialogue?
Well, I would say, well, let me first, of course, thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks for the Institute for this invitation. Let me clarify things. Now, Iran's issue has to come to represent an increasingly complicated and interactable global dilemma. It's not only regional. History has shown that the region will not enjoy security and stability unless this impasse that now extends beyond the Middle East to affect global interest is solved. Major political, economic, and social trends in Iran indicate that more severe consequences will follow if the international community does not find a way to solve this problem and bring Iran back into its orbits. While Tehran has exploited the West's focus on its nuclear program to extend its regional influence and develop its missile program, the other approach represented by the maximum pressure campaign was not enough to tame Iran and bring it back to the negotiation table, although that campaign has achieved some positive results. Regional approaches to solve the Iranian impasse have also not taken into account the delicity of the ruling regime in Tehran, nor the nature of relation between the government and the deep state, rendering them hollow and superficial. International initiative also show superficial understanding and inability to dialogue into ideological, psychological, and historical factors surrounding the Iranian issue. So perhaps it's time to move towards a direct dialogue between GCC, the regional actors, and with Tehran without mediation. This, however, does not mean at all a call for bilateral dialogue between regional countries and Iran, as I heard in the panel yesterday, which Andrew Parasiliti was moderating. Such dialogue will not serve the regional stability due to the huge imbalance in power and the deterrence between these countries and the lack of opportunities to find solution to controversial issues with regional and international dimensions. There is no doubt that inside Iran, the Arab Gulf countries suffer most from the ongoing stalemate. Hence, Arab states watch the attempts to settle the Iranian issue with great concern. The Arabs also fear that Washington abandoned of dialogue in favor of outsourcing solutions to regional partners may undermine essential engagement with Iran by restricting any cooperation to bilateral basis or purely regional negotiations without international supervision or auspices. So with this concern in mind, the international community and the GCC countries must devise an innovative initiative to resolve the impasse before it reaches the point of no return. So such regional initiative should enable major world powers and bodies to oversee negotiations. Their involvement could ensure the implementation of outcomes and encourage adherence to the resulting agreements. I know Tehran doesn't want any involvement either from US or from UN in that regional dialogue. So without resolving this impasse or the impasse with Iran, the coming years are likely to see more costly instability and violence as consequences of the Iran expansionist projects.
Thank you. Abdullah, I have a similar line of questioning for you. The Biden administration has shifted its focus away from the Middle East, or at least it's tried to. I'm hoping you can talk a bit about how regional players can facilitate dialogue in the Biden era, specifically when it comes to the Saudi-Iranian rivalry. Which countries are best positioned to lead that dialogue, and is there an opening for the US to play a supporting role?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I want to echo my colleagues and thank you for chairing this session, and also want to thank the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy for this kind invitation with such a distinguished panel and colleagues here. I think, to the talk about the pivot from Asia, or the pivot from the Gulf and towards Asia, is overstated. This is not new, it's not a Biden policy, it's been there for a while. Obviously, the United States and Biden administration wants to lessen its footprint in the Middle East in general, and the Gulf in particular. And they want to see some normalization, and they want to sort out the conflicts in the region. And there have been some attempts at doing that, and we are seeing those attempts actually are bearing some fruits, and some of them are in the making. And I'll come back to that if I may, but I just want to say that there has been some changes globally, of course, with the US intention, as I just explained. There is also a global shift in power as well. We have some new players coming in to the region, whether it's China or Russia, etc. We also have some, there is also a regional dynamics that are taking place. Of course, now the three most important countries that really matters in the Middle East is Iran, Turkey, and Israel to a certain extent. The Arab countries have been sidelined for a very long time, and they've even been sidelined from sorting their own problems as well. and there are issues at the that combine all of these. We're seeing that the oil prices are going down because of the impact of COVID-19, and of course the transition from in energy as well. All of that has created an atmosphere where the countries in the region, I think, have come to a point where there is a fatigue of conflict, and they are facing some serious domestic, economic, social issues that they need to sort out. The Biden administration obviously wants to do this and wants to help in that regard. I don't think it is leaving the region, because the region will not leave, will let that happen. As we are seeing, the region will impose itself in many ways on US agenda. So I think there are countries that can help in this regard. Obviously, there are countries that have good relationship with both Iran and Saudi Arabia, but the most important thing is to have Iran and Saudi Arabia, and maybe the United Arab Emirates in that regard, sitting on the table, of course, with the other Gulf states, to sort out their problems. And countries like Oman, for example, I happen to come from Oman, but that's not the reason I say that, is that they have established this good relationship with both sides, that they can help in doing so. But I think the United States could also help. To answer your question, it can help in many ways, and we've seen that the fact that the Biden administration is now talking in Vienna, or although indirectly at the GCPOA, and maybe there's a return to the GCPOA, has actually changed things. So what happens? The US policies has an impact on the region, and of course, if it has good intention to sort out the problems, as we see that it is happening, I think there is a room for reconciliation between the countries and the region. And I think the imperatives now and the economic reality that are taking place is forcing all the countries in the region to think differently. And we are seeing there are strong signs for that. The Gulf crisis is being resolved. There is that move towards, resolving the conflict in Yemen. There is a dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And of course, there is a rapprochement now between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, etc. So there are signs that finally the penny has dropped, and the regional countries want to talk, and obviously the international environment has created that into a certain extent. I'll stop here if you like.
Okay, great. Lots to dig into in the rest of the panel. So thank you for that. Ambassador Allen, I'd like to get your perspective now on the situation in Gaza and Israel. The White House says it's engaging in quiet diplomacy to end the conflict. Biden has expressed support for a ceasefire, but not outright called for one. And he's gotten a fair amount of criticism for that. What do you make of the US approach so far? Should the administration be more vocal in demanding a ceasefire, or in your experience, is private pressure on the Israelis more effective?
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. And I'd also like to join my co-panelists, thanking the organizers at the Institute for putting the conference together. I doubt that they imagined that they'd be in the middle of yet another conflict in the region when they chose these dates. So no matter how much Joe Biden had hoped he could ignore the Israeli-Palestinian quagmire while he focused on COVID, the economy, China, and Iran, the conflict, as is always the case, came back to bite him, and once again, it has sucked up much of the world's energy and media. It was telling, for example, that the president visited a Ford plant in Dearborn, Michigan on Tuesday to highlight electric vehicle production, but refused a request to speak to a group of Arab Americans there. It's a region that has one of the largest concentrations of Palestinian Americans in the nation. So despite leading an administration that has made much of defending the values side of the values and interests debate, and has not shied away from criticizing China, Russia, and Myanmar for their dismal human rights records, Biden was clearly reluctant to engage early on this issue of the conflict. Why? The simple answer, as some have suggested, is that Biden understood that Netanyahu would not end the bombing quickly, and certainly not before Hamas was convinced to stop the rockets. So he and others, including his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, called the Israelis often, deploying what you called quiet diplomacy. But Biden decided to wait to pressure Israel publicly and more forcefully. Another reason, I think, is that Biden has a history with Netanyahu, and he knows well that Bibi doesn't care much about what US presidents say these days, especially Democratic ones. You may recall, for example, that while Biden was on an official visit to Israel as vice president, Bibi embarrassed him and President Obama by announcing a slew of new settlements. Then, of course, Netanyahu violated all the rules of diplomatic protocol and came to Washington uninvited by Obama. He spoke to both houses of a Republican-controlled Congress in an effort to scuttle the JCPOA. In fact, Netanyahu has effectively ignored all entreaties from US presidents, from Bush 43 through Obama and Kerry, and even to some extent from Trump. It took the Abraham Accords to stop Bibi's annexation proposal, not Trump's displeasure about it. The settlements project has continued throughout Bibi's tenure, and there have been no efforts on Israel's part to restart a peace process or ease restrictions in 12 years. And frankly, this will continue to be the case unless and until the US is prepared to up the ante and adopt far tougher measures against Israel, a la the George H.W. Bush administration in the early 90s. Much has also been made of the fact that there is no US ambassador to Israel, and there's no Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East for that matter. The reality is that such delays at the beginning of an administration are not unusual, and neither a new ambassador nor an Assistant Secretary of State would have been any more effective or successful than the president himself has been. Finally, Biden has to manage the minefield that Congress and his party have created on this issue. Almost all Republicans continue to support Israel come what may. The Democrats, however, are now more divided than ever between the pro-Israel crowd and the Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez slave critics of Israel. From the Beltway's perspective, it's much easier to criticize China and Russia on human rights grounds than to force Israel to stop, quote, defending itself, unquote. And to be realistic, before the Biden administration or any other can have any real influence over this conflict and its root causes, we need new leadership, both in Israel and in the Palestinian Authority. I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you for that. And you mentioned the Abraham Accords, which I definitely want to get into in a bit. But first, I'd like to talk about Yemen, because President Biden says that under his administration, diplomacy is back, in particular when it comes to Yemen. And since taking office, he's taken a number of steps that were welcomed, I think, by the Houthi group. The administration rolled back the Houthis' terrorist designation, restored aid to Houthi-held parts of Yemen, and of course, cut off military support to the Houthis' arch rival. And yet we've seen this major escalation from the group. So Trita, I'll go to you for this. Why have those actions not paid off in the form of the Houthis coming to the negotiating table? And how do international mediators even make the case to the Houthis that laying down their arms at this point in the conflict is in their interest?
Thank you. I think, first of all, we have to recognize that what the United States does have is leverage over Saudi Arabia. It does not have much leverage over the Houthis. I don't think anyone in the Biden administration thought that ending the support for the Saudi onslaught in Yemen would cause the Houthis to necessarily back down and move towards a diplomatic solution. What prompted the US withdrawal of this blank check that had been given to MBS by the Trump administration, and earlier on, frankly, also from Obama, was the political situation here in Washington, D.C. Congress made it clear that they were going to move forward with a bill that had passed in the Trump era, and Trump had vetoed it, a bill that would have put an end to all US support for the war effort in Yemen. And the Biden administration moved ahead of that move and announced the end of offensive arms sales to Saudi Arabia in order to essentially make sure that Congress would not tie its hands on that issue. I don't think there was any expectation whatsoever that this necessarily would have caused the Houthis to come to the table. To get that going, we actually need to have diplomacy, and some of that is taking place now. I think some of the most important diplomacy is taking place in Iraq between the Saudis and the Iranians, and the UAE played a role in helping set that up as well. That's where the Yemen issue is now on top of the agenda, and some progress seems to have been made. At least enough progress has been made that both sides are now acknowledging and speaking positively about that effort. And I think that effort in of itself is important to understand why it took place now. There's been plenty of opportunities for regional diplomacy throughout this area. I think a critical factor that caused there to be more of a symmetry of interest in diplomacy is the fact that the perception, at least, is that the Biden administration is going to be more serious compared to previous administrations when it comes to leaving the region. It may very well end up being, as one of our colleagues mentioned, that a full leaving of the region is not possible because the region doesn't leave the United States. But Biden did withdraw troops, or made a decision to withdraw troops, and has begun withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. He has made it clear to the Saudis that the blank check is not there any longer. He has started engaging very seriously on the JCPOA. And the politics in the United States has changed dramatically. Almost every Democratic candidate during the primary election last year pledged to bring the troops home from the Middle East. I think it would be a huge mistake to underestimate the degree to which the American public is really, really fatigued with the military presence in the Middle East. All of that, I think, has contributed to a situation in which, in Riyadh in particular, a sense that it could continue its foreign policy behind a shield of American protection no longer was an option. And when that's no longer an option, suddenly diplomacy with Iran, however difficult it may be, however painful the concessions may end up being, however challenging it may be to actually get to a result, nevertheless becomes the optimal policy option because the other options no longer exist. And I think it tells us something. Had there been a withdrawal or a serious pivot away from the Middle East earlier on, contrary to what a lot of people in Washington have believed, which is that if the US is not there, chaos will ensue. The only thing that is stopping a complete Armageddon in the Middle East is the US military presence. We're actually seeing some data that suggests otherwise, that the regional states are responsible enough to realize that they will be in a very, very bad situation if they continue the hostility, and that diplomacy is the best option for all of them. I think the United States should encourage this. I think the Biden administration has been playing its cards quite well when it comes to the diplomacy in Iraq. They have not interfered in it. They're allowing the Iraqis and the regional state to have ownership of itself, but at the same time have expressed some quiet support for it. I think that's a trend that should be encouraged, because ultimately, sustainable stability in the region will only come about if it has deep anchoring in the regional states themselves, and that they have ownership over the process and the outcome of that diplomacy.
Well, let me just follow up with you on that. You mentioned Riyadh's role. Some Democrats in Congress, actually a group of senators today, put out a letter calling on President Biden to put more pressure, both publicly and privately, on Saudi Arabia to lift its blockade in Yemen. What kind of diplomatic levers can the U.S. pull right now to incentivize Saudi Arabia to lift those restrictions? What can realistically be achieved?
Well, I find it, the conversation about leverage in Washington is a rather peculiar one, because we tend to believe that we have leverage to be able to essentially force countries that we have no relationship with to capitulate, but we don't have leverage when it comes to dealing with our close allies who are somewhat dependent on our defense umbrella, or in the case of Israel right now, the idea that there isn't leverage over Netanyahu, which is a common belief in Washington, I find quite stunning, mindful of not only the military aid that is provided, but also the massive political support that is shielding the Netanyahu government from the consequences of its own recklessness at the UN, for instance. So I think the United States has a massive amount of leverage that it can use. What I think it's critical to do is that it needs to be coupled with a clever and sustainable diplomatic effort. So it's not an effort that leads to tilting the balance of the conflict in a particular direction, but it is actually making sure that the diplomatic process is moving forward. So in the case of Yemen, for instance, it's not going to lead to one side having a complete victory over the other. I think ultimately, though, I think it's important to understand that the extent to which the United States extracts itself, creates a bit of a distance, is helpful because it actually enables the United States to play more of a mediated role and a peacemaking role, rather than what it has had in the last decades, in which because it's been so close to some of its regional allies that it actually has become a co-belligerent in many of those conflicts, which has made it so much more difficult for the United States to actually play a constructive role in resolving those conflicts.
Abdullah, I'd like your take on Oman's role as a mediator in Yemen. During his recent trip to the region, Senator Chris Murphy said that U.S. officials have called on Oman to pressure the Houthis to agree to a ceasefire. Does Oman have that kind of leverage with the Houthis right now?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth, for that question. I think what many people don't know or understand, that Oman has actually opened space for all the factions in Yemen to be there, to be able to talk and have a dialogue and negotiate. Because after all, it is the Yemenis people who've got to sort out their own problem. Obviously, there is a regional dynamic to that, but the people in Yemen have to do so. So the Houthis are, some of them at least, or some of their leadership is taking that advantage, and they stay there in Oman. But so is people from the STC and from the legitimate government of Yemen. They're all there. And I happened to be there at one point where I saw them, all the three groups at least, having lunch together and talking to each other. Oman has good relationship with all the factions in Yemen, and of course the Houthis included, but not exclusively. Obviously, what Oman is trying to do is two things. One is that Oman wants to see an end to this war in Yemen, because it obviously has no utility there. We've seen that the war has not really achieved anything in that sense. And it has caused humanitarian catastrophe, and Oman wants to help with that, because it's also the most affected country in that regard, because there's the only border that is open to the Yemenis to find refuge and find some kind of medical help and assistance. Oman is trying to extend also some humanitarian assistance to at least the areas that it can reach in Yemen, etc., and has always called for an end to this war, and through dialogue and through diplomacy. Now, does Oman have a leverage on the Houthis? I don't think so. If you want a blunt question, because the Houthis themselves have their own calculations, and then they have their own interests, and they know what they want. Obviously, Oman can facilitate, can help, can nudge them in one way or the other, but I don't think that Oman has a leverage. I don't think any country has a leverage, including Iran, in this sense, on the Houthis. So if we have to deal with the Houthis, we have to understand them, and we have to work with them directly and understand their concerns, and also deal with the reality in the ground. I think Oman is trying to facilitate that. Oman is trying to open that space. So at least there is some dialogue going on. A dialogue is better than no dialogue and no diplomacy. And that's what Oman is trying to do. But Oman does not have an upper hand on the Houthis, and it cannot push them in one direction or the other. Obviously, they know what they want, and what the peace, the offer from Saudi Arabia obviously is very important, to cease fire, etc. But obviously they don't see it the way that perhaps some of us see it, and it doesn't meet their demands. And that's what we really need to understand. Where are they coming from, and tackle that, and by understanding it, we can deal with it, rather than trying to put pressure. And as I said, even Iran, that of course does to a certain extent support the Houthis, not as much as people think, but it has given them a lot of support and so on. I don't think that Iran has an upper hand as well to tell the Houthis what to do. So I think what we need to do is, I think what the global community needs to do is to understand that there has to be an end to this war. It has not achieved its objectives. Obviously, it is, it hasn't sorted out the problem in Yemen. If anything, it has exacerbated now, and we are now seeing, different dimensions to the war, where maybe there is a secession of the South. Maybe there are other, vested interest parties that are difficult to manage, and groups, of course, that are now armed. And they're going to be very difficult to manage them. So the quicker we can put an end to this war, the better. And I think, we have also to deal with the reality that the Houthis have actually withstood all that power that has come from the Arab coalition. And they have been able to sustain it, and they have actually gained momentum. And therefore, we've got to understand that and start negotiating from that side. If we negotiated earlier, perhaps the Houthis would have been, they're not in such a position as they are now. So I think they are now in a much powerful position that they want to dictate their terms, and they don't want just, an offer of a ceasefire that doesn't give them what they want. What they really want is lifting of those sanctions, opening the ports, opening the airport, and obviously sharing in the income as well. But I think we should move beyond that to see that there is a Yemeni government that is much more inclusive of all the parties concerned, not just the Houthis themselves, but all the parties in Yemen. And it's up to the Yemeni people whether they want to be one state or two states. That is entirely, that is a decision that has to be left to the Yemeni people themselves. I'll stop here if you like.
Okay, no, thank you for all of those excellent points. I want to turn now to the Abraham Accords and shift gears a little bit. So the Palestinians at the time described the Accords as a stab in the back, but supporters argued that normalization would give the United Arab Emirates and other Arab nations leverage to advance the Palestinian cause. So Ebtissam, I'll go to you for this. Has the latest bloodshed in the region undermined that argument, given that it's Egypt and Qatar, two countries who are not signatories that are leading the truce efforts? Or do you see a role for the UAE and the other Abraham Accords countries to play in mediating, either in this crisis or down the line?
Well, what happened, Elizabeth, shows that the spirit of the Abraham Accord is based on the importance of diplomatic solution, de-escalation of conflicts, and the adoption of pacification to create an environment of stability and engagement and development instead of wars and conflicts. So if I will say that what happened, of course, it's shocked by all means. It might push Arab or Muslim countries which were encouraged to establish ties with Israel to wait, be careful, and take more time, or might reconsider such a step. The mental and psychological dimensions of the conflict are important in our region and must be taken into consideration, even if we agree that the mutual interest of Arab and Israel definitely surpass the Palestinian issue to security defense, trade, investment, and diverse strategic partnership. But anyway, lessons must be learned from what has happened in order to be or to cement elements of moderation and tolerance, protect human rights and shun violence and discourse of hatred. It is highly important to keep civilian and innocent people away from the conflicts. An agenda of political and electoral competition. What must be encourage other countries to join the normalization process with Israel is the adherence to these standards, as well as the clear display of the fruits of Abraham Accords signed with the UAE, Bahrain, and of course, not to mention the key aspects of the success of the arrangement between Israel and also Morocco and Israel and Sudan. So the more the Palestinian suffering is exacerbated, the more pressure will be placed on the Arab countries that have already signed the normalization agreement with Israel, and the more embracing the solution will be for them. So it's extremely important that the current problem be dealt with a thoughtful and a measured way. This should help convince the people of the Arab region the importance and relevance signing peace agreement with Israel. So in this regard, the Israeli bear the greatest responsibility for peace. They should end the occupation of the Palestinian territories and harness Israeli right-wing and violent groups. For their part, also the Palestinian share the responsibility for peace as well. They need to be realistic in their political proposals, work under one unified political leadership, stick to the peaceful means of expression, and refrain from all acts of violence against civilians. The international community, for its part, must also help build confidence measures between the two sides as a way to provide an appropriate foundation for holding serious negotiation. It would be wise if that the Palestinians be among the winners of the Arab or the Abrahamic Accord or this treatment. Now, coming to UAE, of course, now UAE has retreated that the ending violence, protecting people's lives, and preserving their dignity, and the two-state solution is the best way to solve the Palestinian issue. The UAE has also affirmed the need to protect freedom of worship in Jerusalem for all believers, Muslim, Christian, and Jews. The holy city should remain an open place for coexistence, tolerance, and cultural religious diversity. The historical character of the city and the solid rights of the inhabitants should not be changed, notably the Palestinian residents in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. So I think UAE can never accept the killing of civilian Palestinian by Israel, nor the killing of civilian Israeli by Palestinian. However, the main purpose of Abu Dhabi's call for de-escalation of conflict and peaceful solution is to first and foremost protect lives, properties, rights, and human dignity. I think nobody will win from conflict. Now, if we are talking about the region, the main challenge facing us all the Arabs, the Iranian, the Israeli, and even the Turks. How to accept to be in the formula of win-win situation rather than winner and losers.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Allen, I think I saw your hand go up. So I'm going to give this one question to you from our audience, which is, how can we defend normalization after the failure of Arab states to influence the war in Gaza? And then my other question for you is, President Biden, the Biden administration has indicated that it would like to build on the accords. We've seen several countries floated as possibilities. Does the current fighting between Israel and Hamas make the prospect of those future accords any less likely?
Yeah, well, I think we have to recognize that the accords coming as they did at the end of 4 years of a Trump administration, which was particularly hard on the Palestinians, having closed their office in Washington, having closed the consulate in Jerusalem, the US consulate, having cut all aid. I think in some ways the Abraham Accords for the Palestinians were in fact a stab in the back. We all know that prior to that, the Arab Peace Initiative had stated that in return for movement toward a two-state solution, then recognition by the Arab states would come. And this turned out to be recognition of Israel in exchange for a temporary halt to annexation. I know it's very positive for the UAE and for Bahrain and for Israel, but I think as you suggested, I think the current conflict and the rather timid response from the Gulf and from the Arab world in general demonstrates that in many ways the Palestinians are on their own. And I guess that points to the reality, something that Trita and others have said, that ultimately, it's not going to be for the United States to solve this problem. The ownership is going to have to be taken by the Israelis and by the Palestinians. The United States can put pressure on, and so can others. The EU is the largest trading partner of Israel. But we need the kind of leadership there that is going to take ownership of the issue and move it forward. I was a bit skeptical of the Abraham Accords. I hope that they will become a force of good, as opposed to in the region generally, not just between the parties to the accords, but that they would actually contribute to peace between Israel and Palestine. We haven't seen it yet. Let's hope that we'll see it in the future.
Okay, I want to shift gears and go to Saudi Arabia and Iran, which we know now have been holding secret talks in Baghdad. This comes as Mohammed bin Salman was quoted recently as saying he wants a positive and good relationship with Tehran. That's obviously a remarkable shift in tone from the Crown Prince. So Trita, on the Saudi side, what is driving this engagement? Can you talk a bit about that and whether the change in power in Washington and the perception that the US is disengaged from the region is a factor here?
Thank you. I think it's probably one of the main factors. As long as there was a sense in Riyadh that Saudi Arabia enjoyed essentially a blank check from Washington, then we did see a remarkably different conduct by the Saudis, from the kidnapping of the Lebanese prime minister, to the blockade of Qatar, to the war in Yemen, to the beheading of Khashoggi. So withdrawing that blank check, making it clear that the Saudis cannot conduct a foreign policy in which the United States, without asking any questions, would bail them out whenever they ended up in any trouble, I think has caused a major rethink. I mean, it is quite stunning. In 2017, MBS gave another interview to Saudi TV in which he said that there's no reason whatsoever. You can't negotiate with Iran, compared him to Hitler, etc. Said that he's going to take the fight against Iran into Iranian territory. A couple of months later, we saw some terrorist attacks in southern Iran. And now to come out with a much more constructive message. Obviously, Saudi Arabia has legitimate problems with Iran. None of those can be wished away. But recognizing that the Saudis cannot wish Iran away, Iran cannot wish Saudi Arabia away, creates a completely different scenario in which the two sides essentially have to deal with each other. Before, as I said earlier, I think the option of engaging in that painful diplomacy was simply not as attractive if the option of hiding behind American power existed. Now, when that option is at least perceived not to be as reliable as it was before, diplomacy becomes much more attractive. I think that's a good thing. And I think, and hopefully the Iranians will deal with this situation responsibly as well and not overplay their hands. You hinted earlier on that that is perhaps what the Houthis are doing in Yemen right now. So I think all of this is very positive. The talks have primarily focused on Yemen. There seems to have been some degree of success there, at least, because one of the primary things that the Saudis are asking for is to make sure that there, at least as a sign of seriosity, there is a reduction of Houthi attacks into Saudi territory. And I think it was mentioned earlier on by Abdullah that, you know, the Iranian influence over the Houthis is vastly exaggerated. So it's not entirely clear who really has that leverage over the Houthis to be able to pull them back. But this is promising. Hopefully will continue. And I think if the Yemen problem can be resolved in somewhat of a satisfactory way, this does provide the opportunity for a broader regional dialogue, perhaps even moving towards something more institutionalized, a new security architecture for the region, which truly would be needed. I found it tremendously promising. Again, I want to emphasize this is all still very embryonic, but it was still promising to see that this is not just a Saudi-Iranian dialogue. The Jordanians and the Egyptians attended one of them. The Emiratis were one of the first ones who have actually been pushing for this. The Iraqis deserve a tremendous amount of credit in the role that they're playing in hosting it. And of course, the Omanis who've been doing this more than anyone else and probably laid the groundwork for this to be able to be clinched. This is all very promising because we're seeing regional actors taking that responsibility on their own to resolve their own problems instead of looking to China or Russia or the United States or any other extra regional powers. It's still very embryonic, but it's such a promising trend. It's difficult not to get a bit excited.
And I do want to talk about Iraq's role. Maybe Abdullah, I'll go to you for this. You know, we know that the prime minister has relationships that he built in both countries during his time as intelligence chief, and he has plenty of experience dealing with sectarian conflict on his own turf. Could we see Baghdad take on a bigger role as a Middle East mediator?
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. And I agree that Baghdad has, and we should be, you know, we should allude to what just Rita just said, that, you know, they should be congratulated for what they are doing. Baghdad has good relationship with Iran. The government in Baghdad and the prime minister obviously has good relationship with Iran. And also he has been able to build some good relationship, excellent relationship with Saudi Arabia and also the Gulf states. And to be for Iraq, it's very important that you know, that there is actually some reconciliation between the Gulf states, because on both sides of the Gulf, as it were, because the longer this antagonism continues, Iraq suffers in many ways, but as well as the region. So given his, of course, background, given his connections within Tehran and also with Saudi Arabia and the leadership, other leaderships in the Gulf states, they have been able to start this secret dialogue that later on was announced and became public between the Saudis and the Iranians. And I think, you know, one of the issues, of course, is the stopping the war in Yemen. And I agree with it, that is the most, of course, pressing issue, especially now for Saudi Arabia, and especially stopping the Houthis' missile attacks against Yemen, because that doesn't only cost Saudi Arabia, you know, in terms of reputation, etc., but it does also cost it financially. Every drone or every missile that they throw, they have to defend it with a very expensive arsenal. And given the fact that Saudi Arabia is now trying to, you know, diversify away from oil and do their Vision 2030, etc., the last thing they want is just this prolonged conflict and prolonged war. So stopping that war obviously is very important now for Saudi Arabia. And I believe that this is something that has been discussed in Baghdad. And the Iraqis played a very, very important role, given, of course, as I said, you know, their linkages and their vested interest in seeing this region stabilized and you know, using diplomacy and dialogue rather than, you know, wars and conflict. And I think they want to move beyond that to see that you know, particularly Saudi Arabia and Iran start to you know, reduce this misperception that has been mounting for many years. And as you know, if there is no dialogue, there is always misperception, and you read the other the wrong way. And I think both countries actually are in a situation where they need to talk and they need to cooperate. And they know this conflict has been very costly to them. It's been very costly for the Iranians and the Iranian public as well, because, you know, of the maximum pressure that they had endured. But also it's been very costly for the Gulf, and we're spending fortune in, you know, armaments that are, you know, not going to bring any peace in the first place, and it's taking away valuable resources that we need for economic development, given the fact the challenges that we are now facing because of the fall in the oil price, etc. And of course the visions and the attempts to diversify away from oil and build a sustainable economy. If we are bleeding in these conflicts, we cannot spend that money in the development of the region. And we don't have to forget that also beyond just developing our you know, the GCC states, we are now going to be facing countries in the region that you know, the post-war conflict or the post-war rebuilding of these states. Yemen is going to need the fortune to rebuild its economy, to rebuild the state. So does, of course, to a certain extent, Syria. And most of these countries are going to be looking for the Gulf states to support them. And the last thing the Gulf states want to do is spend more money on buying these sophisticated arms that are not going to be useful in any means, and they cannot even protect us. And we've seen how much, you know, Israel has been challenged by a group that does not have a sophisticated armaments and of course under siege for a very long time, but yet they have been able to embarrass Israel. And, you know, the nature of the conflict has become so costly for everybody. And I think, you know, given, of course, the changes that are taking place, we talked about earlier that they're taking place globally, regionally, etc. I think there is a fatigue, there is also of conflict, and there is a recognition that only peace and dialogue and diplomacy can actually get us out of this situation that we are currently in. And I think Iraq is doing a great job in terms of getting Saudi Arabia and Iran to talk in Baghdad about these things. I'll stop here.
You mentioned Gulf engagement with Syria, which is something I hope we have time to get to. But first, I want to grab an audience question here, and I'll open this up to the group. What role can other major powers like Russia and China play in facilitating interregional dialogue in the Middle East? Will there need to be two parallel dialogue initiatives for a new regional security architecture for the post-US withdrawal from the Middle East, considering talks between Iran and Israel are impossible? Whoever wants to take that.
Could I take a first bite at that apple?
Sure.
Based on what I said earlier on, the fact that the region is doing this on its own right now, I think is something that outside powers should allow to continue. There can come times, of course, in which some additional facilitation and help from the outside would be helpful. But mindful of the strategic importance that the region still has in the eyes of many external players, if you suddenly had a Chinese involvement, rest assured that will be seen quite suspect by the United States, as well as some other countries. I think the Iranians, for instance, would like to see the United States not to have any role at all, but that is not much of an option from some of the GCC states. I think if we can get past this period and get the region to move towards a more structured dialogue, at some point, I think it actually would be valuable to have several of the major powers involved as facilitators and stakeholders in a positive diplomatic outcome. Because at the end of the day, they have interest in the region, and I would not rely on the P5, for instance. I would make sure that countries such as India or Japan, others who are major consumers of the energy of the region, and as a result have a stake in stability in the region, are involved. That actually helps dilute the role of some of the other players, in the sense that neither the US's role nor the Chinese role would be so dominant if we can expand a little bit further. But it should not be done in a way that takes away the ownership and leadership of that process from the regional states themselves, because that is one of the most valuable elements that exist right now.
I just might jump in, Elizabeth, just to say, I heard one of your panelists yesterday describe Russia as a rather old gas station, and it's probably less of an issue, I think, in the region, other than the fact that it's disruptive desires. It will try and disrupt and cause problems for the Americans. I think the Chinese pose, as Trita suggested, a more interesting and a more difficult issue, both for the United States and for the countries, because we've seen China using its investments, its economic power, its infrastructure to try and influence in a major way other regions. And I'm sure they would love to be able to insert themselves here. And I think it's something that the Americans will be watching probably pretty closely. Thanks.
Ebtisam, I see your hand raised. You want to go ahead?
Oh, yeah. I would say that the US still has the advantage of being the global power that can most influence regional issues, and the one that it's most influential overall regional stakeholders. This fact must not be underestimated, even with the talk about the US desire to withdraw from the region or keep distance from its crisis. So China and Russia are still incapable of playing this role. However, any approach to initiate a dialogue must take in the interest of both Moscow and Beijing into the consideration. We saw that after the signing of the strategic agreement China also has a proposal for the Gulf security, but also, I mean, I would say for the whole region's security, which include also Palestine issue in it. Of course, countries like Germany also can be very helpful in this regards with the US and EU support. It can help narrow the differences and reduce the mistrust between Iran and its regional rivals. This option will be of great value, particularly if Iran's presidential election leads to the victory of the conservative and hard line leadership. Some other regional actors can play secondary supportive roles, such as Oman, which Abdullah mentioned. However, there will be a need for a decision at the international level that can really resolve this issue at the end of the day. I'll leave it.
Okay, I want to get in one more audience question. The question is, if a more institutionalized or informal multinational security arrangement ever comes to fruition in the region, how credible or effective could it be when partners such as the Palestinians or Kurds may feel delegitimized further by not being involved? So whoever wants to take that, the floor is yours.
I can give a quick comment if no one else wants to jump in. I'm not hearing anyone necessarily suggesting that they shouldn't be, but I think when we take a look at the history of other regions in which some form of a regional architecture has been created that brought about stability, it needed to start off with some of the major players taking the first steps, but it would be a mistake to exclude other players, regional actors, as that process goes forward. But if you don't have some of the major powers involved from the outset, the likelihood of success, or the likelihood of even progress is extremely limited.
Ambassador Allen, I'd like to go to you with this one. Tensions between Iran and Israel have reached a new level in recent years, complicating efforts by the US to salvage the nuclear deal. Détente, much less any sort of direct diplomacy, is probably out of the question for now, but what role can countries like Canada and the United States play in at least lowering the temperature?
Well, unfortunately, Canada doesn't have diplomatic relations in Iran right now, and so its role in that country is rather limited. And like many other former diplomats, we encourage the government to re-engage with Iran. It's the only way to have influence. I think the increased tensions between Iran and Israel are extremely unfortunate and potentially dangerous. And I do hope that the JCPOA can be negotiated successfully, and ironically, that may actually lower the temperature because Iran may feel less threatened at that point. The region can calm down and move forward, and Israel will be less of a player once Iran's situation has calmed, as I said, and the nuclear issue is at least taken off the table. So I think the P5+1 has a major role here. There's been some positive news out of the conversations, and I do hope that they will progress, and I think that will lower the temperature.
I do want to get in a quick question on Syria and its international pariah status. We've seen an effort from a number of Gulf states to welcome Damascus back into the fold. Abdullah, what is driving this engagement, and what is the likelihood that we would see Syria welcomed into the Arab League, as some of its members have called for? If you have a minute for that.
Right. Okay. I think, Elizabeth, what is happening is now we are seeing some kind of a shift in the regional politics. Obviously, this has you cannot ignore, the global politics at large, but the Gulf states have obviously went against the Assad regime and stood with the Arab Spring and the revolution in the first place. But they've just found out that the regime in Syria was very resilient, obviously with the help from Iran and Russia to a large extent. And obviously they're now seeing that because of what is happening in Syria, it has a ramification on the whole region. There is, of course, the humanitarian issue. The people have been killed and been displaced and refugees, and of course the hunger and the poverty that is taking place. But add to that, there has been a political and geostrategic gaps that have been filled by regional powers. And from a Gulf perspective, they see Iran is very active there. They see Russia is very active there. They see Turkey is active. So obviously this conflict has not in Syria has not helped the overall situation in the region as a whole. So there is now a recognition that they've got to go back and try and get Syria back to the Arab League and to the Arab fold, maybe reducing the the outsiders' influence in Syria, and all at the same time, Syria needs to be helped to get back to that level. We're talking about billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars that that needs to be extended to Syria to help rebuild its economy, to help rebuild its future, and to bring it back to the Arab fold. And we've seen that Saudi Arabia has had some talks with the Syrians. We see that the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain establishing their embassies. Oman, although it did not close its embassy, but it withdrawn its ambassador. Its ambassador is back. We've seen that Jordan has opened the trade route now between Syria and Jordan. Egypt is called for bringing Syria back to the Arab fold. So basically, there is a recognition now that this Arab body has become, as it were, the Arab League has become too weak because of all these conflicts, whether it's in Syria, in Libya, anywhere else. And I think there is a recognition by all the people involved and the countries involved that we want to bring them back, and we want to strengthen the Arab League, and we want to keep regional powers away from interfering in what is Arab politics, as it were. Whether that will work or not is another matter, because Syria, because of what happened, has established very strong relationship with Iran, and that's not going to be easy to change that. And obviously Turkey is a different matter, whether Turkey will because it has its own problems with the Kurds, whether it will actually welcome Syria back is another matter. But I think from an Arab perspective, they definitely now in the move to bring Syria back, strengthen the Arab League, strengthen the Arab body, and stop outside interference. At least this is how they see it. And obviously there are some steps that have been taking place, and maybe some positive steps. And I think to end this conflict would be however we look at the the regime in Syria, that's a different matter. But at the end of the day, what is needed to be done is to end this catastrophic conflict that has happened in this country and has cost a huge cost to the Syrian people and to the region at large.
Okay, there are so many questions I'd love to get to, but we are out of time. With that, I'll wrap things up. Thank you to all of our panelists for what I think was a really informative and thoughtful discussion. So thank you. And thank you to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy for organizing this conference today. And to all those watching right now, please stay tuned for our next panel discussion titled Arms Race and Terrorism in the Middle East. That begins at 12 p.m. And thank you again to everyone who joined today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Great moderating.
Yeah.
Thank
Good
you.
to meet you all. Thank you.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.